Hello everyone, today we talk about the origin of the term artillery and all the anthropological rather than just military concept that lays behind that, right? Vocabulary is important in the art of war, military history. For example, I remember talking to my tutor back in the day during my, I don't remember where, because she followed me throughout all the path, let's say probably it was the master or the PhD. She was surprised that I used the term artillery, and it was even the bachelor, it was the bachelor actually, for siege engines of an early medieval context, by the way, because I passed from early to high to actually to late to later medieval warfare. And I pointed out that, yes, the term is correct, at least in the way we came to etymologically develop it, because the term artillery does not refer just to firearms, but to some kind of broader attire. As we will see, this is in part actually the same etymology of the term, believe it or not. The term artillery is also in itself a cornerstone of military development, right? It doesn't actually, early medieval times, for example, they wouldn't use it, right? It emerges from one of the most, as you know, propulsory, rampant moments in the development of Western civilization. It traces its origins to the old French atelier, first recorded in 1164 by whom I made a video about the other day, Chrétien de Troyes, right? The seminal 12th century poet whose Arthurian romances, like in fact the aforementioned work or Lancelot and Percival, shaped medieval notions of chivalry and power. I would like to stress this aspect because, again, one could simply make the history of the vocabulary and the etymology of the term, how it was used in literature, how it came about, what it used to define most of the time. But of course there is also a point of why did this term came about, and especially from which mindset, from which expressional needs at a deeper level than merely a linguistical one, right? Because when you think about artillery, you can think about Bayard or Ariosto. You know from Western literature that it's something very often used, in fact in modernistic and technologistic terms, as sort of the knightly killer, right? Or better, killer of knights and slayer of chivalry. And so something almost dichotomically opposed to the latter. The guns kill the man-at-arms. That's a vision that we have somehow etched in our collective center, at least from the history that we're mostly being told. And actually, the term stems not just from, of course, older times, but from at least from the point we can document it, from one of the sort of most romantic, literally romantic, and traditional and poetic and chivalric authors of the era, right? Chrétien de Troyes shaped medieval notions of chivalry and power. And he also talked about warfare, also quite technically, as we've seen in the passage that we read and commented from Heraclitanite, talking about clashes, brutality, blood, arms, armor, etc. So the fact that Chrétien in the second half of the 12th century, a moment of change, but also still a pretty archaic and primitive one, especially compared to the one where artillery, as we mostly intended, as the firearm came around, there were powerful artilleries at this time in the form of trebuchet and so on, expressed with such, cognition of cause, with such so concrete idea of how important this already was in warfare. In fact, his use of atelier, meaning literally to equip or adorn, reflects a culture where warfare was both practical and performative, with lords showcasing authority through not just individual deeds, like in the duel in the tournament in the Heraclitanite passage, but also through finely crafted arms. Technology was already very important, of course, it had always been, and in this time in Western history, you know that technical achievements are really surpassing the rest of Western Eurasia, to a degree that, especially from places like, in fact, where the langue was spoken, like in this case, reached their highest pinnacles. Where we look at France, England, Italy, Spain, to a degree, we have like a very intense level of technological development, of theoretical, that we can't start to document in this sense, but we know floating on actually a much broader and sounder practical basis, right, for this development. And seigneurial power at this point, being gradually surpassed, especially by feudal monarchies, was measured in that ever more hierarchical sense, meaning that only kings at this point could start truly having that artillery park, for example, in order to battle against fortresses like Chateau Gaillard, for example, and or just even having the means to found the same. I made some videos about the cost of castle construction in fact, 12th, 13th century France and England. Equally, we talked, I think, in comparison about the development of trebuchet warfare between these two the most important monarchies, except perhaps the Sicilian one, at the same time, where in fact similar developments were occurring in the same way. And we understand how much of a matter of international pride having, for example, literally the bigger trebuchet, the Mons-en-Pévèle, really was, right? We know of specific, once again, I made a specific video on that back in the day. There is a medieval artillery playlist if you want to check that out about trebuchet. Really winning specific names and lording over, just like kings, over this plethora of actually many more, and actually pretty technically identicals, even though there were different types. But again, in the size, like smaller siege engines that sources are also much less vague about, because in fact it wasn't much about the technique that mattered, but the size in that regard. Because behind that, it's not just a matter of power, it's a matter of, in fact, simply the capacity to field them. And so what derived politically and socially from that, who had the greatest armies, the most impressive weapons, right? This mattered a lot. Still in an age that is dominated by cavalry. At some point I will make another video more specifically dedicated to medieval artillery in general, and others dedicated to medieval artillery in depth. But one thing that I like to discuss is that, let's say, medieval artillery, while primarily employed in siege warfare, was actually brought, like some pieces, of course, were sort of more complicated to simply even field or make ready for like an open field engagement. But actually artillery at large, right, was used in open field much more than we tend to realize. So as we've seen in the aforementioned Erech at the Needs passage, violence and, say, clashes were so chaotic at times that like everything could really happen. We just don't have too much information about, say, Chrétien de Troyes, smaller engagements. And also from later times, you of course understand that typically artillery wouldn't necessarily have had a prominent role, or a relevant one. However, aside from the fact that many clashes occurred within, say, half fortified spaces, etc., but also the boundary between, again, a small catapult and a big crossbow, for example, were pretty feeble, right? And we can't quite categorically just discuss that. As much as we don't hear very often that knights could easily have a crossbow for secondary weapon, for example, we also don't hear about this stuff, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't actually there. Regardless, again, of all the limitations that would make, all the other conventional arms more viable for an open ground engagement. In any case, from the aforementioned data about the etymology of artillery, the anthropological lens that we can read them through reveals society where tools of war doubled as symbols of prestige, a theme echoed in the terms roots, in fact, attille, meaning ornament, armor, or gear, and attillement, military equipment, right? So it is, it's just like the atelier, right? It's the concept of getting geared up, right, appearing, being adorned in some way that is eventually functional to another. And as you understand, it's just like from the fashion parallelism is a pretty sort of exhibitive issue, right? It develops exactly in the time of Chrétien de Troyes, in the lock of the high nobility of Europe, the development of feudal courts, etc., exactly because the former was able to show off that magnificence also on the battlefield. They weren't the only ones, though. By 1268, Etienne Boileau, a royal administrator under Louis IX, Louis the Saint, and author of Livre de Métier, so the book of crafts, like a detailed record of Parisian guilds, if anything, used artiller to describe craftsmen forging war machines. In other words, these were the artillerists, right? We're talking particularly the builders of projectile launching devices. So by this point, we realized that something had developed more conventionally defining artillery as the actual projectile stone throwing, like projectile throwing devices, right? The passage here it's not entirely clear from the origin. It's possible that artillery had to do with some kind of concept of the scene of support, something adorning, not being necessarily the core of it. So, say maybe knighthood, the men at arms as such were not considered as part of artillery, but artillery just like a support to the same. This could include perhaps initially some other weapons. Here at this point, or for example, mobile fortification, siege engines, we do not know. By the second half of the 13th century, we're in a very advanced, as you know, phase of the medieval art of war civilization. And it's quite meaningful that under, in fact, the booming phase, like the reign of Louis IX, where France basically took off. Like this is the same year, the Battle of Tagliacozzo, where Charles of Anjou defeated and later killed Conrad in Australia. There is the fading of the empire, etc. Like properly the peak of especially French feudal chivalric culture. And yet, of course, this imposant military apparatus was providing itself with also way more advanced artillery than before. It's interesting how gunpowder artillery kicks in mostly in the moment of crisis of medieval civilization in the mid-14th century, in part perhaps because of some economistic reason, right? The rampant development of Western civilization in the previous centuries have probably brought to a less degree of paradoxically of effort in finding the sort of more necessarily performing kind of engineering in this, which is may sound strange considering what a masterpiece the trebuchet was. Like we say, ancient cultures did not have that kind of firepower and precision. It's also, of course, connected with feudal society in particular. However, say crisis always stimulates technology. Here, the system France is booming, but is also gradually slowing down in the process after the peak of power is being achieved. And it's as if some greater speculation was, say, some greater effort was invested on much in wars of expansions that did exist. Like, if anything, they were mostly wars of containment. Here we are in 1268, so where before, for example, the French attempt to conquer Catalonia, also the later one to take over Flanders. There are still wars against the Bretons, the English, etc. But at large, this moment of peak may have stimulated some greater technological experimentation, right? And also one that at that point was importantly needed in siege warfare, that had in the same way achieved some incredible pinnacles that would be only, say, radically, those gradually smoothened, right, and changed by the introduction of gunpowder artillery. This is also a time in history in which the French monarchy serves itself more frequently of third estaters for the development of a sense of statehood, a bureaucracy, etc. So that Boileau's work is not random. It's a snapshot of medieval urban economy, underscoring the artiller's role as a skilled artisan blending metallurgy and carpentry to serve feudal lords, thus linking craftsmanship to military power. Right. There is probably also a great underestimation of the Third Estate in French armies of the 13th century, because the power of the system, like just the sheer amount of the population, the agricultural resources, I have to say, once dead, in fact, are able to field some of the most updated systems. And even though chivalric literature, especially in countries like France, tends just to talk mostly about the elite, when you look at Gothic cathedrals, you realize that it wasn't the elites simply building them. Of course, they founded them, etc. But just like on the battlefield, there would be lots of third estaters that participated in pretty consistent number to make that happen, right? So it's the flourishing, again, of a specific medieval civilization. The artillery term's early breadth is vividly captured also by Guillaume Guyard, a 13th century chronicler and soldier whose verse chronicle Branche de Royaux Lignage recounts French royal history. His definition of artillery is artillery refers to the transport commissioned by a duke, count, or king, or any lord of the land, loaded with bolts for warfare, including crossbows, darts, lances, and shields of similar design. All right. So this is incredibly relevant because it shows how we're not talking simply just about a weapon, but a proper feudal logistical chain. Right. We see here, of course, already an important reference to the fact of projectiles shot by machines capable, evidently, of being loaded with all this that would be varied themselves based on that kind of projectile ammo that is here counted in large quantity and supplies. But we are told even of shields, right, that are actually brought with this transport. That's how artillery is, like mostly the wagons as well, etc. That signal the belonging, the feudal identity of this all this apparatus. That thus is something that really gives you the dimension of how much was really put together for a military expedition. It does not just revolve around artillery per se, but it's very interesting to think, which is hardly ever done, in the evolution of medieval armies, considering especially probably the later medieval ones where artillery was just and firepower artillery just a more, say, a common, right, from a certain point onwards, a practically omnipresent necessity. The vehiculation towards ever more specialized, I would say properly power, I could say firepower to a degree, that revolve around the logistics, the supplying system, the wagons, the bolts, so all that could and would serve armies that still at this point, 13th century, were mostly based on cavalry and would remain so for a long time, especially in these countries, right? France, for example, never had its own, infantry victories. Just the English do so on French soil, but some countries, some of the most advanced, by the way, simply go on with cavalry preponderance, even when their infantries were actually stronger than the ones of those somewhere managed to defeat cavalry on some occasions. So this latter aspect, this sort of capacity of serving the army in an ever more concerted and adorned way, is properly the meaning behind the concept of artillery. Guyard having fought in the 1304 Battle of Mons-en-Pévèle, offers a soldier's perspective on the era's reliance on mobile arsenals, highlighting artillery's role as a collective term for war tools. Right? Again, he talks here a lot about projectiles, about ammo, right? But at large, he still sees, and this is why it's interesting, because he sees this, at the end of the day, secondary aspect of military ammunition, considering all what was needed really to arm and equip a host of the time, towards this sort of projectional effect in firepower for dimension, which is very interesting at this point in history, where before I didn't address that, but it would be to make, as we will, of course, at some point, to make a video properly about like when, say, the connection between the spread of gunpowder in function of the development of firearms that is not simply, in fact, instantaneous at all, right? And we think, in fact, that technically gunpowder was available from a long time. Surely the ingredients were there, and surely the admixture was already known, let's say, well before we can especially document firearms that, after all, started developing pretty quickly. Again, probably for some reason did not necessarily have to do with simply the discovery of something, but just the necessity to exploit that, to adapt it to the specific military purpose. I will not go down this road today because it's a very interesting, very controversial, in fact, hotly debated topic in medieval military historiography that tends always to hyper magnify with fireworks, etc., the concept of revolution and all this kind of stuff that, frankly, is quite dangerous and damaging, probably of a scientific and moral discourse when we talk about the art of war. In any case, it's in fact fascinating that Guillaume participated to the Battle of Mons-en-Pévèle. That was, as you know, basically a draw, but still a pretty disastrous also battle, in fact, for both the French and the Flemish, right? Essentially, this was the last time the Flemish stood their ground and did not come out defeated, like in later battles from the previous victory of Courtrai 2 years before. At Mons-en-Pévèle, Philip the Fair, King of France, risked to be killed on the spot by the angry Flemish mob. A knight courageously, kneeled to have him jump on saddle and run away, and had his own head cut by the enemy. This was a brutal battle in which basically the Flemish resisted to the cavalry charges of the French, just like at Courtrai, but they counterattacked and broke their formation. At that point, the French had reformed not far away from there and basically managed to hold them and to inflict them heavy losses, right? So you understand it's completely like muscle to muscle, like cavalry versus infantry battle. And Guillaume would be one that in his Branche de Royaux Lignage, by the way, so it's not even just a book about, I don't know, artillery or other technical stuff. It's literally a hymn to properly the French high nobility, chivalry, knighthood. He also illustrates, in fact, what was understood really to be just by an obvious consequence of the traditional case subdivision of the various estates in a hierarchical relation, a tool, if not literally in the hands of knights, but surely commanded by knights, right? Instructed by knights, and just like the nobility commanded the third estate to put this artillery into place during siege, battles, etc. So it's really interesting to look into. In fact, one thing that I hardly ever say, right, at least in function of artillery, but that can be extended to what I often say regarding infantry, that probably the most expert employers of artillery were actually the noblemen themselves, right? This is, of course, the minutiae were left to the third estate, the technicalities, all the sort of fatigue part of the story. It's not like the knights did not fatigue, but not as, helping the artillery on the battlefield, because they would have been wasted. But let's say just like knights were constantly throughout the entire Middle Ages and beyond the best understanders of the potential of infantry, contrary to the notion that they were just a bunch of cocky, arrogant idiots that didn't know that infantry hurt. And especially that's the sort of the fantasy dream of all that want to basically say that lesser people are actually better than elites. It's in fact the opposite. Like, the knights know absolutely well what can be done. They're the ones that have the vision as the establishment, as the regime, as the government, to address their means by using, in fact, these lower ones, and to have a comprehensive military vision that the third estater alone would have not had, right? Even just where to use artillery, where to position it, it's a strategic thinking. In that sense, the third estater, aside from those basic combat skills that, of course, in formation Mac could and would have, did not see, as far as a knight, the function of that firepower against an enemy as in all the reciprocal relations of war, constantly changing. That is, instead, was properly is etched in the vision of commanders of the top. Of course, at some point, third essayists would have made their sensible military decision. And I'm sure at some point, some knight was mistaken and should have better listened to his fellow bourgeois. However, tendentially, this was not true, right? And so, anthropologically, even Guyard's reference reveals a stratified society where lords orchestrated warfare through specialized retainers, with the artiller embodying the intersection of craft and combat, right? Militarily, Guyard's focus on transports, by the way, aligns with other thinkers of war, right, from different eras. For example, Sun Tzu's Art of War, which I never cite because I think it's at least popularly overrated. Then, of course, it's a great work and really an enormous foundation of military theory. But, as a Clausewitzian, you also have to be able to tell the actual difference that people do not seem to understand, really treating Sun Tzu as the Bible is actually a directly applicable thing, and not understanding the philosophy behind that and why that text was written. In any case, stressing logistics as the backbone of victory, of course, like every factor in so many ways, does help. As we explained many times, logistics is not a determinant. You can have a fully supplied army and failing everything with it anyway. So it's actually, as with the saying von Clausewitz explains, not really a branch of the art of war per se. In fact, even, this is the point I was making before, even a civilian, a bourgeois that picked up his weapon just the day before for battle, would know very well, very skillfully, how to keep armies supplied, for example, with this artillery, also in the previous meaning as well, all these cards. Why? Because they would be able to do so just on a regular basis for fairs, for markets, for supplying also other armies without fighting, etc. They knew how to make the train work, but not necessarily where to move the army for that thing to still remain supplied adequately, which is instead what a commander would have known, including together with, let's say, how much food, say, or ammo can arrive to keep the army supplied at that point. And that's a very strategic concept that is not logistical. In fact, it contains logistical considerations, but it's altogether finalized to a military purpose, which is exactly what logistics is not per se. Always remember that. And of course, Sun Tzu basically makes the point that leaders will prepare well, say, triumph as well, so which all is the obvious purpose, which also aligns with von Clausewitz. The best strategy is to be very strong, which seem to be a banal statement, but it's actually not. If you're familiar with von Clausewitz theoretical architecture, because it really gets to the point, like, of course, commendo tutus, right? If you are in guard, you stay safe, basically. So the more precautions you've taken, in absolute terms, not just logistical ones, the better it's going to be. But then how to do it is another story, and that's what, in fact, von Clausewitz explains it all in much more scientific and moral terms than Sun Tzu's. So by the 16th century, Antoine de Lalande, a Flemish noble and chronicler under the Habsburgs, provided a glimpse into artillery's evolving role. His Voyage de Naples, a detailed travelogue from 1522, describes Maximilian I's arsenal in Innsbruck, this sort of midway between Flanders and Naples, in the heart of the Alps, and very important city in Tyrol. In fact, under the Habsburgs at the time, it made also a video about medieval Tyrol, especially revitalizing in the 15th century, and also because of military industry under Maximilian. In fact, quote, the king had a building constructed along the aforementioned river to house his artillery, containing armor, culverins, crossbows, pikes, bows, halberds, two-handed swords, and maces of all kinds. Right. So this is really interesting because it again shows how still by the Renaissance, artillery had a more extended semantic reach, right? We're talking here, sure, of culverins, for example, of actual, what we conventionally call artillery today, including also other projectile weapons like crossbows, bows, etc. But also armor, right? Would you call armor artillery? Pikes, halberds, two-handed swords, maces of all kinds. So again, Lalande would likely be also influenced by French enough to have maintained what was surely, in fact, surviving even across the centuries. This greater sense of artillery is something that you basically used to furnish, your army to equip it to armored gear, supplying. There are different terms like maintenance, sustainment, in different European languages as well as in Latin. Like there is a term munere, munimenta. There are all kinds of definitions for what here is intended like as artillery. Lalande, a trusted courtier of Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, to, as you know, we can say modernize, if we at least believe in the notion of modernity, that this is not exactly the point, say made warfare a bit more Renaissance, right? True. In fact, artillery, I made even a video about that, imperial artillery from Maximilian to the 30 Years' War. That's actually very important. And from the time of Maximilian, in fact, we know fairly a lot because the German monarchy was, especially in this, at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, faring particularly well in terms of recording administration. Then it's a bit more a problem. They spent less, and so we also know less about artillery. But as you know, that would be just an accessory, an auxiliary arm. Mostly, Maximilian established the Landsknechten that also made multiple videos on. We'll come back on. Lalande documents this transitional arsenal, so to say, where traditional and gunpowder weapons coexisted, which was also completely normal at the time. As you know, there are, especially from Germany, Italy, that were at this point the most technologically advanced countries in Europe, plenty of beautiful drawings. They include, Leonardo's. There are so many, and depicting things that would have not even necessarily been practically used in warfare, but that come out of a range or a plethora of incredibly detailed technical projects, plans, depictions, etc., that make us understand exactly what the actual technology of the time really was on the battlefield, and not only. And so Lalande's account is significant for its first-hand insight into Habsburg military reforms. He was actually in the Innsbruck arsenal to witness to that. And as a product of the centralization of imperial power projected through artillery as well. In fact, when Lalande specifies pieces of artillery for cannons, he signals already, considering that the term had come around, a semantic shift towards gunpowder's dominance, right, reflecting a military culture adapting to technological change, so including in that more generic concept of artillery new weapons that were also, if you think about it in perspective, the more, at least qualitatively expensive, right, the broader gear of the army. We also talked in the video about Maximilian's artillery, how costly that was, right? Artillery was incredibly costly, so even though you had to mostly pay, I don't know, the knights, the pikemen, the arquebusiers, etc., artillery in fact, in numerical terms was by far the most expensive arm, and it was essentially to gain such a robust prominence in that specific sense, relative sense. Anthropologically, by the way, the Habsburgic centralization of power mirrors the rise of state power, with artisans and engineers serving monarchs over feudal lords. Here we are in the full ancien regime. It's just like, I don't know, the Landsknecht, and the role which we explained as a new estate, basically meant properly like to extract it from the fourth one mostly, were for the final rank soldier that was redeeming and sort of giving a chance to them to have a higher status as imperial holders as well, because they were properly the Kaiser's military, which were, however, basically just proletarians. Like, this is the point. Like, the revival of infantry. Oh my God, infantry were so bad. Has anything to do with the revival of individuals? Absolutely no. Aside from the Protestant Reformation, it was literally saying that individuals were completely worthless, whatever they did, and the best that they made, even at war. And I've also made videos explaining how that this specifically dehumanizing and rationalizing aspect of Protestant also military vision that helped, in fact, acting collectively, but also diluting the individual valor of the fantassin, that in fact, say, by the 18th century had nothing in common with this early, like, I don't know, Swiss or German pikemen. They were really something almost, especially the Landsknecht, and some kind of former aristocracy, and instead dramatically losing power, in this case already from the second half of the 16th century, probably at a social level, and with the corresponding military dissolution, basically. Really shows how, in fact, knightly, lordly, regardless of the shrinking importance of cavalry, this system actually was. Meaning, truly, the bourgeois or the peasants, protagonists of infantry-only victory at the beginning of the early 14th century, were truly, in relative terms, much freer people than the Swiss or the Landsknechten, right, or even just the Tertius for that matter, because society was completely taken over after the mid-14th century, and radically and traumatically so by the great princes of Europe that in fact were the ones funding the same infantry. It's not like these guys could simply found themselves on their own. We've seen it also in the video about the German Peasants' War, for that matter. It was pure butchery, because of course these people were completely worthless at so many levels. And so the here Sun Tzu actually, today, I don't know, I want to cite Sun Tzu, like it states at some point something like controlling the army through unity, which is actually a Catholically imperial principle, right? Here, Maximilian I definitely as a great monarch of the era perfectly embodied it. Similarly, Jean de Roy, that was a Parisian notary and chronicler, so we were a third estater of Louis XI's reign, that, as we know, liked very much third estaters because he wanted to trigger the nobility. I recently made a video about the French nobiliary revolt during the 15th century, right? And Louis XI was the guy who went the heaviest on those, etc., and uses the term artillery in its modern sense, specifically in his work, the Chronique Scandaleuse, 1460-1483, which is also a bit mirroring that change that sort of also affirmation of a noblesse de robe, right? Some kind of institutionalization of third estaters elite, as you know, in the parliaments of France. In fact, the fourth estater had completely lost that by the mid-14th century, what I was just saying. This work is a vivid account of political intrigue and warfare, basically. It's a bit already distant from a more traditional view of, say, like, for example, the previous works that we cited from the 13th century. Why an insider at Louis XI's court himself documents the king's use of artillery to consolidate power, notably during the War of Public Weal, 1465, that again I discussed just last week in some depth. His work is crucial for understanding how gunpowder artillery became a royal tool, enabling monarchs to subdue rebellious nobles. The Chronique's use of artillery for cannons reflects a linguistic and military pivot as gunpowder reshaped warfare. Anthropologically, Rice's perspective reveals society transitioning from feudal fragmentation to centralized authority. You know that the proponents of the so-called military revolution and this other amenities, so to say, stress very much like the connection between the centralized state and the development of artillery, and specifically costly technologies were pointed out. And again, the concept is not wrong. The problem is to consider a modern state as if, first of all, I don't know, a 12th, 13th century feudal monarchy was not centralizing or had a degree of centralization. Only modernists decide what is centralized or not centralized. We just really, they go beyond physics themselves. With that, we should definitely follow them. And for fielding trebuchet artillery, it was incredibly costly for the time. The problem, in fact, is that there is no revolution whatsoever. I mean, the term revolution, which is also improper etymologically, historically, whatever, I accept it only for just, I don't know, the French Revolution or the American Revolution at Similia. Must revolve just around, we decide there is a revolution because here we decide to draw a line 500 years from the events and pretending that that's the actual game changer. And the weirdest thing that I always say as a military historian myself is that they make the military revolution depending on, 1450, 1650. 1650 is actually triggering an exponential boom of actual further modernization, technologization, the size of army, everything much bigger, much more rapid, and exponentially accelerated than anything that had happened in the previous century. But that's not revolutions, guys. The revolution is just the one at the end of the Middle Ages because fuck those evil feudal lords. We are the moderns, we are the progressists. And he said, I don't know, in the mid-17th century, nothing happened, by the way. And nothing happened, by the way, in the actually most aristocratic country in Europe, namely the one of Louis XIV, the Sun King, that literally became an hegemonic force on the continent. But never mind that. The revolution is just before. Even though at the time nobody literally ever thought of this like a revolution and other stuff like that. But again, we have to suffer. What's the worst of these things, historiographically speaking, is that the scholars that provide with this stuff sometimes are also actually good. The problem is that for some reason, and especially I'm not going to make the same old polemics about where this stems from, but it's as if the rest of the world had to, because they eventually, the same scholars come up with these things, began to criticize themselves. All right, so can we skip the whole thing in the middle? Once you have acknowledged, look, what was fairly good, we still believe before historically, and then what you have acknowledged with this criticism, can we skip the in-between? Can we simply, reduce it to history of historiography, but not having to still reference in every single paper the concept of military revolution? If we want to write something about modern warfare, it would be much healthier from a mental point of view. It's as if a person went crazy at some point in their lives, and then they got healed, and say, now every person, in order to understand this, should become crazy and then heal. No thanks. There are people who work fine all the way and do not need to waste time and energies to pass through that. This is exactly what happens with modernistics in history, right? And let's be honest, the modern era doesn't exist. It's just a scam for, in fact, selling stuff, and only the Middle Ages and the contemporary era existed, and there is up to 1792, 1918. As I always say, were actually the same fundamentals of medieval society were there, right? There is no doubt that this, until the French Revolution in the West, was a thing that also up to the fall of Central Empires in World War I, this was the actual system. It's not medieval as a hyperbole, it's literally how it came out of that, right? Regardless also of the process of secularization and modernization that had already been happening. So the shift from trebuchet to gunpowder artillery was gradual as well. We discussed this in some videos. Firearms kept being used in parallel with more traditional type of artillery. At some point, we're not even as performing as them. I mean, how do you calculate that? More or less, you can argue that technologies achieve more or less the same performance comparatively, meaning that for how many, in that case, more traditional siege engines, there would have been, artillery pieces, let's say firearm, gunpowder artillery pieces that would have performed in a comparable way. And so this gradually towards the end of the Middle Ages brings to the end of traditional, so to say, artillery, at least especially in the West. It was the most technologically developed part, at least in the way properly. This kind of, if you look at the 15th century, is the most armored period ever, or like artillery in the capillary way was used in the West. Like, you realize that especially in Western Europe, there was really a completely different pace of warfare compared to most of Eurasia. To say the least, the Ottomans also do a big deal of thing, but they also have a different distribution of other technologies. Like for example, the level of third estate quality that the West had was unknown in the rest of the world, right? The Ottomans did not have the thriving bourgeois society that allowed the West to reinforce properly the basis also of the nobility of the church. So early cannons reliant on inconsistent gunpowder and stone shot were more spectacle than substance to a degree. It's as if they had been a deception in warfare, but it's an ungenerous statement. Say every time you see these weapons employed, you realize that there is a cost-benefit ratio that brings them to be useful, right? There is definitely something to them that performs correctly. In fact, again, the notion that artillery also would have initially just scared troops as opposed to hurting them, it doesn't make any sense, because the way they were employed, they were loaded, etc., and say armed and employed, was always very concrete. Was always even aimed at disturbing the enemy, at creating like some sort of disorder, and even stunning and amazing him, but mostly ever more directly to actually hit and smash in some way, especially fortifications, etc. So actually, as soon as gunpowder was around, you realize that, for example, explosive shells were there. It was immediate, really. What could be done with this was basically, at least as long as, again, the costs allowed for the artillery to be viable, like they developed all the kind of functions that, the basic functions that we know of, right? Not just the power of the shot per se, all the joules that were really unprecedented just in terms, even in firearms, like against armor on the longer run, but already from the 70s, the 80s, like you find in countries like Italy, 1/3 of the infantry equipped with handguns, right? But also the explosives, right? The Venetians, the Mamluks, especially, were pretty darn good at that at sea, right? Well before the Ottomans developed their own artillery, which was not such an immediate process instead, especially compared to the West. But to some point, the Turks became dominant, at least in the technology. It's debatable regarding the granulation of powder, whether it was probably an Ottoman thing or not, but they were, at least, in fact, the ones who mastered that adopted it the most for their own specific strategy, doctrine, so to say, in anachronistic terms. They had very specific purposes that to another degree, the Westerners did not at least have by that scale. And we'll explain. I talked this in videos about Ottoman warfare, but you kind of understand. Like taking by storm the Mediterranean, places like Malta or Belgrade or Famagusta for that matter, etc. Like all those coasts, all those mountains requires very consistent firepower. It's not to say, again, that in West they didn't use it, right? And in fact, for the Ottomans, we're talking mostly about the pinnacles of technology, not necessarily even just the most, in fact, performing firepower tactics. In fact, the Ottomans did not really have an equivalent to the pike and shot, not much, in fact, because of artillery, because of the lack of that third estate bourgeois infantry, so to say, but also in a way, in fact, it was not conducive to the spread of firearms at larger, to a larger amount of increasingly drilled troops like it would happen in the West. So even if you have a monster bombard, so to say, that does not mean that you actually have the upper end in firepower. And then, chapeau to, I don't know, mostly we get this from Western sources that tended to, not to sabotage as always, but there is this sense of, oh my God, like the Ottomans are impressive, they're not barbarians and so on. They had apparently very good snipers at Malta and in these other places, in sieges, etc. But at the end of the day, everything was much more sort of highly crafted in certain specific cases, but it wasn't so regularized, like, for example, in pike and shot tactics that also pretty much like exploded in the West by the same year. Chronicles like Yachts suggest trebuchet remained vital into the 14th century, as the siege of Berwick, 1319, where mechanical artillery outperformed early guns, of course, that, however, had a purpose. They were emerging. They were opening their own path in the art of war, military technology. So if they were there, they were cool. Like, being battered doesn't simply mean that the idea behind that is bad. Because, again, it's not the technology. It's, again, even banally numbers, how you use it, whatever. The breakthrough came with refined gunpowder and cast iron projectiles. And in general, there is a passage, roughly the 20s of the 15th century, by which the updated Western European prince must have an artillery park, right, in his army, because otherwise he's basically out of the games. Naturally, Europe is, in fact, not just Western Europe, and you find a permanence of sort of medieval warfare, something that dates back to the Renaissance, but still, even in architecture, looks medieval in some Central European countries, for example. But definitely in most advanced areas, like, there were phenomena like connected with this development, like the enabling campaigns of Charles VIII in 1494 invasion of Italy, where French cannons breached fortress walls, really in that concentrated fashion. It's not like bombarding castles at this point was just a child's play, even with these guns, but definitely some of this, say, smaller, say, it was easier than before, and so just the possibility from the side of France, for example, to put together that firepower was at that point the largest in Europe. It had begun from Burgundy mostly, and the French followed suit, and then Burgundy, as you know, committed suicide, and the French remained with that more concentrated statal unity, right, allowing, in fact, their forces to be that performing, especially as far as artillery was concerned. Sadly for them, during the Italian wars, not for the infantry, we said this many times, but they had also very strong cavalry, which also shows you how, even in a country like the one of Bayard, that, as you know, was basically the late 14th, early 16th century French Rambo of the situation. I mean, men that had really a military experience of the kind that it's impossible to fathom, was killed by a falconet shot in his spine, who broke his back, and that it becomes the symbol of the death of chivalry in many ways. But the same French were all about men-at-arms, cavalry, and guns, shooting in the same way. So then we associate, again, especially the Landsknecht and even more the Tercios to that kind of, especially the latter with the El Gran Capitan Gonzalo de Cordoba, to pike and shot warfare that sort of becomes more iconic in that shot element that is made by lots of arquebusiers we were talking about. But initially, it's not like the French had too many problems with artillery, except in using it. It was a bit like always the hypocrisy. Bayard took out, for example, artillery crew, apparently because they couldn't stand them, and he would be killed by some of them. But this had happened even in places like the steppes, like the Tatars, for example, adopted firearms relatively early, but they also had their own chivalric feudal way to think that the gunners were probably lesser people. First of all, it's just like what the Ottoman feudal sipai that were very Apollonian, very chivalric, very knightly, thought of the janissaries that were slaves, and in fact, freemen and infantrymen especially. The notion that gunners had the same stench of hell, right? So that these weapons were made by the devil. This was an idea contemplated sort of more or less metaphorically in the West as well. If anything, because the stench was the actual one of sulfur, so that was the main connection. But this did not prevent guns to ever be used, right? This is a false notion that should be understood mostly from a literary and also anthropological, other culturally contextual standpoint. But it's just like the crossbow, right? There was never a time in which, for example, the church actually banned the crossbow with the expectation it would be banned. It was mostly just like, said, there are dangerous infantrymen in certain areas of Europe that are also heretics and want to take down noblemen, etc. So we have to police who can bring those kind of weapons. And yes, they're kind of immoral in many ways, but it's not like the same nobility and the same bishops operating with those crossbows were considered sort of less, like in the moment in which they actually put down those heretics, right? So it's that's another myth, modernistic, technologistic myth that we were fed by the idea you can stop progress of technology. That's not what it means, right? Technology just is created to serve a specific purpose. If you don't have the will, the means, and the intention to do so, like technology does not spring out of somewhere and magically changes things. Like it's a materialistic, in fact, it's an anti-traditional, often also structuralistic and not Marxistic idea that, I don't know, that things just happen because they must happen just out of some mechanism. No, it's literally people that make technology and make it work all the freaking time, right? In any case, when you look definitely at the development of artillery towards the Renaissance, you realize perfectly well how this prompted the development of the trace italienne, which we discussed in one of the earliest videos I've ever made on Schwerpunkt. So the star-shaped fortresses designed to withstand artillery better, as seen in, for example, works like Niccolò Machiavelli's The Art of War in 1521. Machiavelli, as you know, a Florentine diplomat and military theorists, argued for adaptable defenses, echoing the notion that invincibility, let's say, of the intrinsic advantage of defense that had already been noticed by Sun Tzu, by von Clausewitz. You know, that Machiavelli is just one of the cornerstones, like in Western development, you get to Montecuccoli, then to von Clausewitz, and basically to nobody else, because nobody has ever surpassed von Clausewitz. But we will talk more about this. We've never made so many videos, especially about Machiavelli. I have something planned about Montecuccoli again, because that's yet one of the single most important people in the history of mankind, but nobody actually understands his merit, especially his giantism in the history of the art of war. And so anthropologically, this architectural arms race reflects a cultural dialogue between offense and defense, with engineers emerging as key figures in Renaissance warfare. We talked also about later Vauban. We talked about the role of fortresses in the 18th century. We'll come back again more on the trace italienne because we didn't talk too much about it. But I think you're knowledgeable enough, especially as the followers of a channel like mine, of what we're discussing. So artillery's development also carries artistic weight. You may think that that's not a point, but psychologically speaking, weapons have to be beautiful and terrible at the same time. I made an entire video dedicated mostly to uniformity, but referring also to the the whole package as far as collective training, moving in unison, right? Looking more or less all the same, having these intimidating weapons like really meant in historically, right? We tend to talk this stuff mostly for early modern warfare because at some point there was even a backlash of modernism against the notion that everything was modern, right? Of course, there is an immense anthropological amount of resources to study, like even modern, even contemporary arguments regarding the actual meaning of warfare and the meaning of the warrior, and it's also like that is overstated into warriorism when people think that soldiers are warriors. No, like we left warriors rotting under the heels of our citizen soldiers many centuries ago, and it doesn't work well, in fact, for warriors when they take the field against such foes, right? But of course, lesser people are, emotional and fundamentally dumber than a bag of, the saying is hammers, but I like to say dumber than a bag of hamsters, which sounds funnier, at least gives a bit more intelligence to the thing. And so if you think that the warrior is just like the individual guy who changes everything and makes the wolf, and no, right? The art of war is a serious thing. It's not for the mentally feeble who believe that still, like after the entirety of the annals of warfare, that it's that single guy that makes the thing. If not in positions of command, right, which is a different thing. It still fits the older concept of vassals, just to stick to old Germanic as far as the commander has to be, but not just like the bold warrior he was in his youth and by now a leader of men. That is something slightly different. He already proved to be a warrior, then you have to step up, all right? But regarding the aesthetical aspect, Chrétien de Troyes' atelier, as we've seen, tied to adornment, suggests war machines were crafted by aesthetic intent, right? A notion reinforced by Renaissance canons etched with heraldry, for example. Like we see them, many of them are also belonging to modernity, to beyond the Renaissance, right? We have seen before how the concept of artillery from this old French term included shields, like this whole apparatus, wagons, carts, supplies, not just the actual ammo carried and the actual weapons, but the whole circus, so to say. And so this blend of art and war seen in Maximilian's ornate culverins, for example, that was a mark of fabric, so to say, connected with the spirit of the prince, and so evidently not just a merely empty technological thing, reflects a universal human impulse to imbue violence with meaning, right? As it is actually the path to heaven according to tradition. It's just like you see this Viking sword engravings, right? Of those blades, both from the Rhineland, and highly appreciated for some specific marks of fabrics. The same Polynesian war clubs. There are many other references to this. Now, the artiller's craft, documented by Boileau, was a guild tradition, even merging metallurgy, alchemy, and ballistics. Right, and we didn't talk this enough, but actually behind the artillerist, and so this artiller, regarding to the more celestial turn that a parabolic shot by these firearms could take, even the unprecedented arc of power, that is not in the very beginnings compared to trebuchet, but still was sort of, in fact, as more sky projecting, was actually connected with occult knowledge coming from the earth, and so from chthonic traditions. This idea we were discussing also in Chrétien de Troyes' Erec, where the dwarf, for example, is there as a retina, and it would be this third estater, right? That was expert of how to craft weapons for the heroes from the secrets of the underworld, living next to the smoking furnaces, all covered in darkness, in dirt, etc. So it's being a lower being, right? Does not live out of war, but out of work, which is as you know, in tradition, actually connected with slavery, and in order to serve someone to begin with. So the artillerist actually emerges from that world, right? It's true that, as we've seen also in other videos about medieval artillery, actually artillery spread everywhere, but it spread the earliest and most in it's most documented, of course, in the most advanced parts of Europe. And then you have third estaters that are rich as some noblemen in other parts of the continent, right, or even more. And so actually some of these centers were, as we were just saying, some of the most technologically advanced in Europe. They really had all the means to provide with an insane level of technical authority with them. But the original principle is that these are still not actual noblemen, right? They are to some degree, because if they are freemen, and they can also pick up arms, like it's in the case of communal citizens, there is something to it. But at large, of course, the guy who knows everything about how to build, a crossbow or an early gunpowder weapon is not just a guy who trains the whole day with a sword, just to draw the parallel. A gunpowder artillery demanded new expertise. These artisans became proto-engineers, embodying the idea that war requires excellence in order to adapt, and therefore to think outside the box, and how much you could adapt to the real world. And there is hardly any more real world than war, as also tradition specifically stresses from a metaphysical and spiritual point of view. On the battlefield, artillery's impact was profound, yet limited by logistics and terrain, as seen in the 1515 Battle of Marignano, where French cannons relied on infantry support to crush Swiss pikemen. The synergy underscores, first, the constant emphasis on combined arms, ensuring artillery's role as both a physical and psychological weapon reshaping warfare without eclipsing traditional tactics. In fact, if you really look at this with a broader lens, you realize that at the end of the day, it's still like the same old artillery that is just essentially more performing, but has the same ultimate function, right? The sense that, for example, this is mostly confined to siege warfare, and that it has always those kind of costs, requires specific supplying systems, logistics, etc. That it has a limited tactical role in open field, but it also has it, and it's increasingly having it because of the adaptation to those are the larger armies out there, which is a factor, by the way. Is part of a continuity. It's just like what brought the arquebus to replace the crossbow, right? At some point, this thing concretely happened, right? If you look at 16th century pike squares compared to, communal armies of the late 13th century, realize that, of course, the difference is there. But the actual function, for example, of light infantry, of missile infantry, is always there. It's always the same, right? It hasn't conceptually changed. It's changed to some degree of performance. It's changing the way eventually formations are shaped because of particular tactics. There is a change in the ratio properly of heavy infantry and light infantry, cavalry, etc., in ways that artillery, of course, finding itself in between, has to cope with, has to contribute to, again, in ways that are just the full balance between the whole. So even when you think about technology, reflect on what that practically means. It's not like a random mechanism brought on the battlefield. No, it's an incredibly precisely, surgically, and refinedly funneled tool that has that specific purpose, not just of killing and destroying, but to be balanced in concert, not just like with a musical instrument in a concerto, with other arms that are also swinging, that must be calibrated, must be used, and again, maybe are very advanced, but if you don't use in the right concert, in altogether, they're not going to provide you with that result that you were hoping for, right? So that aspect is definitely relevant whenever you look at the history of artillery and its looking at the background of it seems much more important and much more relevant than simply saying, oh, let's look at the technical performance of this and then simply say, okay, this could smash this or that, right? Because what is historically important is not that you're magically bringing this stuff on the battlefield from somewhere as if you were somebody who wanted to reenact and or test the performance of these weapons. You have to understand, in order to arrive to that, there were attempts along the way. So simply freezing an ideal clash that you want to measure and saying, oh, this is how important that weapon is. We talked so much about this when covering that series on the English tactics of the 100 Years' War as far as the longbow was concerned. And to pretend to extrapolate the meaning of that war, it's already conceptually a mistake, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's basically just materialistic determinism. It kills the most important thing, that is to say, history, people, right? Military history is not made by engineers, as we were saying before, nor by logisticians. You can have soldiers that are also that. As when I was in the military academy as a medical cadet, they told us quite bluntly, you're first a soldier and then a doctor, right? A medic. This is not something you can put aside, right? When you enter the actual anthropology of warfare, when you actually want to understand what this is all about, it's always about this background. And warfare is fought through that background, meaning that even if there was such a radical divide between, technological performance, it's first of all never that even like by far actually brings to that difference. But the system itself would not sustain itself if that difference was there, because ipso facto you wouldn't have that fight. Maybe you would have an entire conquest, but you wouldn't have that fight. And so even the guy who has the best technology would not adapt it to cope with people that still have some chance to counter it effectively on the battlefield. And probably you wouldn't even develop it as much as that would be, in fact, a constant effect on it. So what you're actually looking at in warfare, as we very well know, is the product of a very gradual but constant adaptation that does not necessarily even, in fact, matches perfectly whatever is going to happen on a battlefield, but because that's something you can't simply calculate or predict at all with any mean by definition. And you can roughly understand how it could be, but until you actually even fight the war, we know it. Strategically, tactically, operationally, every single action, every single combat is really different. Right, and this constantly changes and informs different type of warfare, of weapons, etc. And this is, again, so easy to understand. Just think about, during World War I, that we fortunately started making enough videos about how, the Western Front was so immobile, right, or almost, for 4 years, whereas even though trench warfare that people think is just dictated by machine guns and shelling, it actually was not that, was actually more mobile in places like, Eastern Europe, for example, even that far away, to tell the truth. So it's, telling these things is important because it's chiefly not the history of artillery, of the technology, but it's the history of artillery behind technology, behind the surface, behind this notion that, again, you're just looking at some sort of a random thing that happened at some point on a battlefield, and then, hadn't had a continuity, but also hadn't had a graduality in the same case. Like having this double-threaded thing is just like the doctrine of the two natures. Most people are just not mentally programmed to understand that. It must be black or white. It's this or that. It's this factor that is decisive. This was the decisive battle. This was the decisive, and they do not properly understand that the whole point of politics being a continuation of war, being a continuation of politics with other means. And so we need more and more videos about this anthropology, because it also defeats culturalism. basically demolishes the entire structuralistic nonsense that has been fed to people like in the last generations, even including from military academies, by people who haven't even literally opened the Fondkriege, evidently so, self-evidently so, and that presume that have answered. These are the results, right? This is the complete strategic illiteracy that you see even in like all the proliferation of, strategic studies. Maybe they don't even have military history in an actual concrete sense in their curricula. The geopolitics, like this kind of complete, even verbal nonsense by conceptual definition. And instead, like the Clausewitzian reading is the most traditional because it's the most universal, and it really shows how there is no preset kind of, it's done for just for one side that has, for example, I don't know, the worst technology, or it's just like any war in a moment which is fought is simply settled per se, regardless of the likelihood or the outcome, but sometimes exactly for that. And consider always that narrative emerged from places and, say, backgrounds that were so whiny about also colonialism. What a terrible thing. There was no match between Europeans and the first of all, study the actual military history, because it's not even like the Europeans were also defeated. Let's leave aside like post-colonialism just per se, which is also in a sense also a process of the westernization of the world, to also the military means. But I'm talking the 18th century, right? It's not like, I don't know, Europeans simply arrived and began to rule everywhere for no reason. They actually had to fight pretty hard, and they had to outclass at a broader level an enemy that, regardless of being sometimes like to the Stone Age, was able to counter at that point any enemy at the time, also because the Westerners at large were the most advanced, especially say in a military sense, especially from the 19th century. So it's really a matter of historical perspective, how deep you want to go, right? In diving like in military history, in understanding its meaning. This is what Schwerpunkt tries to do for everybody involved, so to say, and sort of providing with the answers that very often are not even addressed, right? And at least I insist very much on the concept of it all, and I think it's right. I think it's primarily like you need some kind of information in actual theory, then always following the practice at the same time, without studying battles and campaigns one after one, like for decades. You can't quite, from the actual sources, reconstructing them on that basis, you can't quite go far, right? And this is what, of course, many people wouldn't like to hear, because they assume that, again, there is the shortcut, the easy way, that everything is easy. Once you nail those few things, it's done. No, right? The more you study military history and the more you are familiar with the notion that everything is fought, that the proper meaning of war is that combat, all right? So if the reason of combat per se is that nobody knows before starting, at the risk of your life, how it's going to end. Right, even if, again, some fights are just maybe strategically functional and tactically suicidal, right? Still, what happens in that combat, you actually don't know. Like, there are so many things that can go in unpredictable ways, and the annals of military history are notoriously filled with such display of unpredictability, to say the least, and more, in as much as again, according to the Clausewitzian principles, like, you're not simply playing chess, right? You're going at war to degrees that connect with literally whether you're going to be alive or not, right? As a country, as a people, your family, whatever. And so imagine playing chess. If you fail, like I slaughter your dog every time, not every time, depending on how many dogs you have, you lose a pawn. And it's like, oh, well, so no, but I meant, no, you don't understand. you lose that pawn and I actually kill your dog, right, in front of your eyes with blood and all, right? That's not even close to what war actually is in terms of intensity, of brutality, of destructiveness. So if you don't, and the actual impact it has on people, until you understand that, it's going to be very, very difficult to understand anything about the world in general, about politics, about civic education, about anything, because you're just living in video games and sheltered places. I'm horrified by how much people think that, for example, like as it can be rightly said, like for leftistic safe spaces are BS, but buy into isolationism, thinking that if they remain isolated from the world, like they're not given the initiative to the enemy, which is a basic element of strategy. Is even the basic elements of strategy, given that it's the reflection of those relations existing between the two contendants, that they're true at all times. And so you realize that, of course, if the left sucks in one country, it's because the right sucks, right? You're not living in separated, compartmented sections. You're just the same lesser people in an inferior culture, and a healthy culture, also shown from a military point of view, always by having, of course, the elite, the establishment at the top, and the lesser people of their society in the bottom, the more intensely pugnacious and combative and competitive it is, the more performing as a civilization is. So evolving into oneself is one of the greatest proofs of cultural inferiority. Not just that one, of course, and imagine it totally from an existential point of view. And unfortunately, this is what people want to be told, right? War being just something you can't decide to engage or not in. That's by definition what war is not, all right? And that's what they are fought to begin with. So, again, we will come back on von Clausewitz, the Clausewitzian theory, because these are things that Sun Tzu, for example, that we mentioned in this video, does say in some way, but does not systematize, does not enucleate, right? Sun Tzu is a guy that tells you, or at least if he ever was a guy, actually, in terms of multiple authors like Homer, that, I don't know, never besiege a city. Okay, sure. So we will now wage war because we have to follow Sun Tzu and the deep Eastern wisdom, because this guy was kind of an expert, never besiege a city. Well, sure. That's how wars are actually fought, like, because Sun Tzu said that. It just takes to have actually read Sun Tzu and not just citing it at random, just thinking that other people are so culturally inferior like you not to notice how much you are, right? That's actually the point. In any case, we will talk more about medieval artillery in the future. In fact, I created a playlist on it, which is always a good thing for you to get familiar with. And yeah, from medieval artillery, 25 videos about artillery warfare. This is the 13th about medieval artillery. So mostly, of course, we talked Middle Ages, mostly about medieval artillery, but we're getting there. We're getting there in terms of covering the stuff to an adequate level. I mean, 13 is a good number. It offers some, important range. Let's say this is usually, you understand how, it's not a particularly long video for my standards, but it's more loaded with info to some extent, at least concerning the anthropological meaning of artillery. So that's where things are more interesting as opposed to actual artillery types, at least from me. It's all more about the imperium physically, metaphysically extending in ways that you should appreciate, in fact, as a whole, not much because of that particular technical aspect, right? Very well, we'll go on with this because I have some specials incoming also on the topic, because we have to further enucleate it. We have to further ingrain this. I don't know how many people watch this stuff. Let's actually look at it, because playlists have views counts that are not the views of the single videos inside, that are much more naturally, but how many people actually click on the playlist, which is another matter. And here we have probably not much, to tell you the truth, because medieval artillery does even find it on the YouTube search. And I don't even remember where I created it, which is actually important, because if it was like 2 years ago, it surely has more views than one. But doesn't even matter. Just to get a gist of how this stuff works at large. And today I'm in another apartment. This computer is slightly slower than the other one. Takes more time, but hey, wait. Only 50 views. Well, that's really poor, frankly. Nobody watches this. But anyway, we could see, actually, but now it's really messing up the entire, because it's then Firefox, especially, but it's mostly, well, anyway, we don't have the simple means to do so. Okay, well, let's wait a little bit more. I'll restart YouTube Creator Studio. And so, as I was saying again, it's interesting to browse military history. The more we expand, it may seem, again, I've always thought that on Schwerpunkt there are some enormous gaps that we are not properly closing. Because we talk about so much stuff, and so again, we actually covered a lot of it, a lot of Art of War possibly, and actually surely more than any other channel online. But not necessarily, in fact, being so rarefied to this level of depth. I wanted just to see how artillery warfare playlist fares in comparison to the medieval one. They were probably created maybe not at the same time. Well, this has 300 views. Well, that probably makes sense, as it also contains the medieval ones. As you know, my playlists naturally overlap depending on the section. In any case, for today, I really stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.